Welcome to this introduction on BPI. We are a law and policy center. My name is Marshida Iwalomi. I am a staff counsel here. I work on the areas of justice reform and I've done a lot of work in police accountability. I am a former PG fellow and we'll talk a lot about BPI, but I also wanted to give the floor to our current PG fellows. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about BPI. BPI is a law and policy center with a mission to combat systemic barriers to equity and to fight for racial, economic, and social justice. We do this by working in the areas of housing, early education, and social justice. Criminal justice and police accountability. If you want to work with us, you should, because we're a pretty dope bunch. You should apply for the Polikoff-Gautreaux Fellowship. The deadline is this Friday, October 15th, and applications are due by midnight, Central Standard Time. And so you should be able to get a link to the flyer for that. It requires a cover letter, a resume, and a writing sample. Very simple. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Amy. Can you tell us your name, your position, how long you've been a fellow, and what has brought you to this work?
Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Thompson. I am a Polikoff-Gautreaux fellow, and I just completed my first year as a fellow and entering into my second year. What brings me to this work is really a commitment to dismantling systems of oppression in an effort to achieve, real, meaningful economic and racial justice. And for me, that commitment started when I was growing up. My mom ran a domestic violence shelter for women and families in rural Missouri. And through my experiences there and with her advocacy, two things really became part of my core values. First, the people who are most close to a problem or who are most directly harmed by something are the ones who are best situated to identify that problem and identify and design solutions. I think, in the intimate partner violence realm, relationships about those are a deeply personal decision. And that became really clear to me that the solutions who were not designed by survivors can be harmful and paternalistic and just completely inadequate. I think from those experiences, something else became a core part of me was really a drive to combat abuses of power in many different forms. And as I grew and my perspective broadened and I experienced different things, my perspective about power has grown and changed with that. And I've really developed a focus on addressing systemic abuses of power and specifically the ways in which systems of power are designed and used to create and perpetuate racial and economic oppression. And, I think that there are a lot of different ways a person can try and do that work. And there are a lot of ways I considered trying to do that work. But for me personally, I think the reason that doing this in a legal capacity fits best for me is that just most directly maps onto my skills and the way that my brain works. But I think there are a lot of different ways that a person can do this type of work. And yeah, that's what brought me here.
Nancy, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy that all of you have joined us for today. My name is Nancy Negrete. I'm the current fellow and policy analyst, and I've been here at BPI for just about a month and a half, so I'm very new, but I'm working with the justice reform team. I graduated in June from the Harris School of Public Policy with an MA in public policy. I'm originally from Los Angeles, but I moved to Chicago in January to finish up my master's degree at U Chicago and also to start work here at BPI at the end of August. I've only worked in the nonprofit space, working mainly on immigration, environmental justice issues, but I knew that I wanted to keep working in nonprofits in a social justice driven space, especially as a Latina, someone who cares about ensuring that communities of color, and someone who has exclusively worked with communities of color. I knew that I wanted to work in a place that really tried to, correct the wrongs that have been inflicted on Black and Brown communities. So when I started my fellowship application, I didn't know which program area I would be working in, whether it was housing or justice reform or police accountability or early childhood education. I knew that all of these areas, they have a big impact on the everyday lives of people. And at the end of the day, being able to make even a small change in legislation, whether it's at the state level or even a local ordinance, that small change in the system, that can have tangible differences in the lives of communities, of our communities in Chicago and all around Illinois. So for me, that's what it was all about. Being part of a network of people and other organizations that really cared about what was going on an everyday basis in Black and Brown communities. And using the skills that we have and talents that we have to make a difference in the system. So that's a little bit about me, but I hope that inspires you to not just apply to the fellowship, but to bring your full self to this work. Hopefully at BPI, but if not, anywhere else that you go.
Thanks, Nancy. Ashton, what about you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashton Hoselton. I am in the second year of the Polikoff-Gautreaux Fellowship, and sadly will be closing out my time at BPI in just a few weeks. But really glad to be able to take part in this event and share my really positive experience with all of you who are considering applying for this fellowship. What brought me to this work was really kind of roundabout. I never intended to be a lawyer. I was studying pre-med in undergrad. And while I was studying, I got involved teaching in the local prisons in Southern California. And that was the first time that I had stepped foot in a correctional facility. And it was immediate that the sort of weight and horror of mass incarceration hit me. And I saw how people like my own family members who struggled with substance use or struggled with mental health issues, people who didn't have resources to handle those things ended up in this system of mass incarceration. And so I continue to be in this work and committed to pursuing this work for the rest of my time because of a commitment to abolition. I believe that incarceration is not the solution to any of society's harms, and with that commitment to abolition, have to be actively involved in building what will replace incarceration, what can actually make our communities safe and keep people in their communities. So I am really thrilled to tell you more about why BPI, but that's really why I'm in this field. And as a first generation student, I saw how people did advocacy in all different ways, brought different skills and capacities to advocacy work. And law was particularly attractive because you can do so many different things with it. So briefly, I sort of made my way from a direct representation in public defenders' offices to more of an impact litigation role, challenging policies, and in that realizing that I wanted to play a role in helping to craft policies that actually work. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Marshita.
Thank you all. So as you all can tell, we have a lot of different stories that we bring to the work that motivates us and drives us. And I hope no matter where you go, hopefully it will be BPI, but you recognize the importance of bringing yourself to this work. It's what makes the long nights and sometimes very tiring mornings worth it, and how we can stay motivated. But in thinking about that, we talked about what's brought you to the work and specifically working in the public sector and why we do what we do. But what about BPI specifically? As Ashton alluded to, there are a lot of different ways, and a number of us have alluded to, there are a lot of different ways that we can actually do this work. There are a number of orgs that we can partner with. So why specifically BPI? And Ashton, since you kind of alluded to it, I'm probably going to just kick it to you first. Yeah, I'll kick it to you first.
Great. Well, first of all, just to address the timeline, I want to let everyone know that I found out about the BPI fellowship the night before the application was due. Part of the reason that the PG fellowship was really attractive to me was practical. I'm from the Chicago area, had not lived in the area for about 10 years because I was away at school. And coming to BPI and doing a fellowship allowed me 2 years to come back to do the work in my home state and really get a lay of the land of the work that's being done, the advocates in the space. So for one, it was just a really great learning experience that allowed me to sort of bring my skills home where I intended to use them all along. But specific to BPI, it is a very small team-oriented office. And because it's a law and policy center, every problem or issue that we approach, we think, what is the right way to respond to this? I think as lawyers, we're trained to think that litigation is always the tool. And I've learned over and over again at BPI that might not be the best way to approach a problem or create a solution together with the many stakeholders that are impacted by these solutions. So for me, it was sort of twofold in that BPI allowed me to come back to Chicago, which I have found has a really energetic advocacy space, lots of movement, and also come to a smaller office that really works collaboratively so that I was supported in all of the learning experiences that I've had over the last 3 years or 2 years, excuse me, I'm dreaming. All of the learning experiences I've had over those 2 years and even sort of problem solving with new challenges that come up.
Thank you for that. Nancy, would you like to add?
Yeah, definitely. So when like I said, I'm originally from Los Angeles. So when I started looking at what my post-graduation plans were going to be, I knew that I wanted to come to Chicago. There's a lot of similarities in terms of demographics, especially racial and economic demographics between Los Angeles and Chicago. And I just knew that I wanted to be in a city, an environment that helped me to really understand the challenges and opportunities that communities of color face. And I think the issues that BPI works on are very relevant. Housing, everyone deserves access to good housing conditions. Justice reform. We understand that the prison and carceral systems are very inhumane. They oftentimes just traumatize people, even more, and folks already have a lot of trauma and pain to heal from. Same thing with police accountability. That's a very relevant issue. And so I just knew that being able to focus on these kinds of issues was really important because I do see Illinois as a leader, hoping to make change in other states. And one change in the system can have profound impacts, that communities feel for decades to come. So for me, it was important to be part of an organization that, worked directly on these issues and worked directly with people that are impacted by these issues. I've only been here for about a month and a half, but being able to work alongside folks that were formerly incarcerated for many years, for example, and are now directors at other organizations, and being able to hear their voices and their experiences. It's important. And I think being able to work hand in hand with communities is central to any cause that we're fighting for. So I would say BPI, does a really good job of working on relevant issues and then also working with people that are directly impacted by those issues.
Thank you, Nancy. Amy, would you like to chime in?
Sure. Well, I, as always, totally agree with everything Ashton and Nancy said. In addition, I think coming out of law school, I had, the bulk of my experience had been in criminal justice reform work broadly, but I also had done work on women's economic security and public benefits policy and employment discrimination. And some of my favorite work had been when I got to work at the intersection or the overlap of those issues. And so the idea that coming to BPI, I would have the opportunity to work on multiple issue areas and do so in a way that kind of re-immersed me back into the Chicago advocacy community, because I had spent 3 years here prior to law school and then had gone to law school in California. So this was a way that I could come back in a way that would allow me to really carve out a path for myself as an advocate in Chicago. And so that was one of the things that really drew me to the fellowship.
Thanks for that. And so I'm hearing themes of location, the substance of the work, but also the approach, making sure that we're touching on relevant issues, but also who should be the driver of the work and how should we be utilizing our skill sets to partner with them. I also want to just chime in on this question just a little bit, where for me, part of the reason I was attracted to BPI was I taught before going to law school. So I was used to working with my students, with their families. And part of the reason I ended up leaving the classroom was because I kept seeing a lot of the same issues over and over again and not necessarily having the power to impact it. And so when we think about graduating from law school, a lot of the public interest opportunities that were available at that time for me were very direct services oriented, which are super important. And so BPI being different from that means that you can attack systems. And I think that that's a huge piece of what was a draw for me. And I know a lot of us from being in conversation. I wanted to add that, but getting back to our regularly scheduled programming, that's what it was. It's programming. Could you talk a little bit about the application process, and Nancy, your experience with having to interview in a virtual world?
Sure. So the application process for me, which was fall of 2019, it's, you submit your application materials, as Marshita mentioned. Afterwards, there is an initial interview where you'll be interviewed by some staff here to get a sense of your interest in the position, your background, and what you can bring to the role. After that, if you are selected for kind of the next round of the application process, there is a writing exercise where you can respond to one of a number of prompts that deals broadly with our work. And then that writing exercise will inform the next stage, which is the final interview process, where you will interview with a number of members of the staff and the BPI board. And they will be able to take a look at, your application materials as well as your writing exercise, and ask you questions about that and get a sense of who you are and what draws you to this work. And then after that, someone is hired.
So I went through the whole application process remotely, obviously because of the pandemic. And I was in Los Angeles the whole time. So the advantage of being able to do the whole application process remotely is that you don't have to be in Chicago necessarily. And, just like Amy said, there was one interview and then a final interview with the board and a few other staff members. But being able to, do the interview process remote, obviously you still have to prepare, you still have to practice interview questions. So really I think the remote factor and the video camera factor doesn't really take away from how important you should prep for the interview, but there were definitely advantages to it, being in a comfortable setting, being able to touch base with other folks who are, were in Chicago about the fellowship, and being able to have, those extra conversations in a very easy manner. I didn't have to travel necessarily to office in downtown Chicago. But I would say taking advantage of other resources, whether it's a career center at your school, I think those resources are incredibly helpful to help prep for interviews, and obviously revising your cover letter and resume. But I would say the remote process for me made things very easy to apply. And like I said, I was in Los Angeles during the entire application process. But it was easy, but it's still nonetheless important to prep.
Thanks. Again, application is due this Friday. You heard from Ashton that she learned about it the day before. I submitted my application the day of. I definitely knew about it before then, but I submitted it the day of. And Nancy just told you, you're interviewing in a remote world, so it's possible. So learned a little bit about the process. Can you all tell me a little bit about what your work looks like? So what is a day at BPI like for you? What are you typically doing? But then also the substance of your work. And I guess I will kick it to Nancy first. So I'll go Nancy, then Amy, then Ashton. So what does it look like to be a new PG fellow, a little bit more tenured, and then Ashton, so go ahead.
Yeah, so like I said, I've only been here for about a month and a half. So I've mostly worked on two projects. They're all research-based. I am a policy analyst. I didn't go to law school. But, nonetheless, I think it's important to, that any kind of legislation or any kind of law proposal be informed by good research and, good data. So the main project that I'm working on right now, just to give you all a quick overview of what I'm doing, is a research project on diversion programs throughout all 50 states in the US. After someone is arrested, a diversion program would help them to avoid incarceration, whether it's a prison or a jail. And usually prosecutors in local jurisdictions decide whether or not to offer diversion programs. And a diversion program could be something like being able to get treatment for substance abuse or for a mental health issue. A diversion program can even be community service or paying a fine, but certain requirements that would allow a person to avoid time incarcerated. And so obviously we want to avoid as much incarceration as possible. So we're working on understanding what are the different kinds of programs available in Illinois and in Chicago, but also across the US, because there's probably other states that are doing really great work, and then some states that have diversion programs, but they're actually hurting folks, right? So if there are diversion programs that have really high fees, so someone who committed a crime, that maybe they could have, for example, a fraudulent check, they wrote a $5 fraudulent check, and a diversion program ends up costing them $300, right? So there's this kind of inequity and disparity. So that's one of the main things I'm working on right now. It's mostly research-based. I hope that as my fellowship continues, I'll be able to work more directly with folks as well and bring some of my skills as a former community organizer.
Thanks, Nancy. Similarly to Nancy, a lot of my work is also research-based. So on any given day, I might be digging into different types of research, but also sitting in on now virtual meetings of the state legislature, city council, local boards to see what's happening in the city and the state. Also having meetings with different partners to brainstorm advocacy strategies. So that's something that I really love about my work at BPI here, is that one day is not the same as the next, and that you do get a lot of different types of work in your particular day. As far as the substance, so I work on two of BPI's program areas, housing and police accountability. In the housing area, it's been interesting to work with BPI on the monitoring of the Gautreaux settlement, which is a decades long piece of litigation on housing here in Chicago. So it's been an interesting experience to see what that looks like. You know, what does a lawsuit that's been happening for 50 years look like? That's been a great experience. I think on the police accountability side, I've really had an opportunity to do a lot of different types of work. So one of my bigger projects that I'm working on right now is thinking about how we BPI can add value to the reimagining public safety space. So we at BPI think that our current public safety system, specifically our policing system, does not keep communities safe, and rather it inflicts significant harm and trauma on communities of color. So, you know, since policing has existed, there have been people in communities of color trying to reimagine it and dismantle it. So we, at this point, as a law and policy center, are trying to think about what are the ways that we can add value and support that work and imagination that's already been ongoing. Other work that I've been able to do as part of the police accountability team over the last year or so, Illinois has been revamping its police officer decertification system. So I had an opportunity to do some research on that, as well as participate in advocacy at the state legislature that we hope helped make improvements to what eventually became a significant overhaul of our state's decertification system. And then finally, another exciting project that I've been able to work on is trying to understand the Chicago's creation of its foot pursuit policy for the Chicago Police Department. So as you all might be aware, after the killing of Adam Toledo and Anthony Alvarez in spring of 2021, Chicago Police Department released a foot pursuit policy. And so we're really trying to think at BPI about what the changes that need to happen to that to really maximize safety and minimize harm to communities of color.
All right. I am really grateful to say, as I see my fellowship come to a close, that I have gotten to do a little bit of everything. I primarily have spent my time at BPI supporting the justice reform and housing teams. As Amy mentioned, my work with the housing team has been sort of twofold. One is monitoring the ongoing settlement. And as I mentioned before, you know, litigation is not always the tool. And we found that over the decades of litigation and negotiating the settlement, that we have developed a really unique relationship with the Chicago Housing Authority, who the litigation is against. And that by working together and finding ways to work together, that we can actually encourage the Chicago Housing Authority to meet their obligations rather than just sort of hold the settlement over their head. And in the long run, we're furthering our own goals, because our goal was not to win the litigation, but to improve how Chicago Housing Authority operates. And we have already seen that sort of happening, even though the settlement is ongoing. The other portion of my housing work has been really interesting because it's been about envisioning what BPI's housing team should do next. And as many of us has mentioned, it's really important that our work, the trajectory of our work, is informed by the community. And so we are in the middle of having conversations with community stakeholders, with developers, with housing authorities to really see what is the value add that BPI can play in this space as it sees a major portion of its work coming to a successful close and is looking for the sort of next opportunity to further fair housing and some of the public interest goals that have been identified. My justice reform work involves a lot of things, as we work a lot in coalition. Some of that is us supporting coalitions. Often I have participated in legislative subcommittees, and so it is looking at model legislation in other states, drafting potential legislation for Illinois, doing the research and having conversations with legislators about what the options are. Often I've found that I am not necessarily advocating for a specific bill, but more stimulating the conversation around where are the opportunities, where are the challenges that we need to address. And that's taken a variety of forms. I will share two really quickly. One of the major pieces of work that I've been focused on is parole reform in Illinois, or really reestablishing parole in Illinois. Illinois abolished parole in 1978, and that means that today there are thousands of people incarcerated without any hope of review or release. And this has cost consequences. This has human consequences. This has huge detrimental effects on our community. And so we have been working with a coalition to envision what that new parole system could and should look like. The other piece of work that I've been really focused on, and so glad because of my higher education and prison experience from before, is really building out higher education in prison in Illinois in a way that allows it to expand and be available to everyone incarcerated in Illinois, and expand in a way that ensures programs are quality programs. And so Marshita and I work together to support the Illinois Coalition for Higher Education in Prison and the Freedom to Learn campaign. The campaign is a part of the coalition, and both of those entities are really focused on developing a model for Illinois and for the nation. We are seeing tremendous growth in higher education in prison programs across the country, and really trying to coordinate what's going on in a way where we're sharing information, where we're learning lessons from each other, and building something that will really work for Illinois. So I have had the chance to play a role in both sort of coalition development, developing a legislative action plan, but also implementation. I've done some program management, and I would say that one of the things that I would really highlight as a huge benefit of my time at BPI is the ability to really dive in where I've felt personally motivated and excited to figure out what it could look like in Illinois. And one of the significant things that I was able to develop during my fellowship that I will take with me in my future job applications and future advocacy positions is that I was able to write a policy report. And I think that for any fellowship, it's really important to keep your eye on some tangibles that you want to walk away with. And I'm glad to say that I will be leaving BPI with more than a couple of those.
Wow. Thank you all for all the work that you do. And thank you for sharing and being transparent. So we've talked a lot about the great things that happen and you've been able to do at BPI. But I also want people to get the full gamut of, there's a lot of greatness, but there's some areas and opportunities of growth as an organization, but then also individually as you are going through this work and this time. So if you could just talk about your experience with the current fellowship, your joys, any learning moments, any challenges, any obstacles. You can tell us about what it's really, really like for the person who's like, oh, if I'm just a fly on the wall, what is it like to work at BPI? Not just on the substance, because you told me about the substance. I want to know about the person, the feelings, the emotion. I want all of that. So I'll start with Amy.
Thanks, Marshita. So Let's see, the joys, the learning moments, the challenges. So there are a lot of joys about working at BPI. I think the one that rises to the top for me is the relationships that I've been able to form with some of my coworkers, many of whom are on this call right now. And I think that those, not only do I interpersonally enjoy working with them, but I also love the kind of creative brainstorming space that allows us to grow our own understanding and knowledge of the work, and also leads to a better outcome eventually. So that's one of my favorite things that I've been able to gain from this experience. Also, one of the great things that you would imagine about having an organization that is decades old and has staff who has been here for quite a while is that there is a lot of knowledge there that you can learn from, not only in terms of legal practice, types of advocacy, but also just institutional knowledge about the city of Chicago. And those are things that I've really enjoyed learning from my time here. As I mentioned, I was coming back into Chicago from being away for a few years. And so some learning moments I've had are really kind of those humbling moments when you're on a call and you realize that all of the 10 names that people just said, you have no idea who they are, and you're simultaneously Googling them on the call. So I think, there are a lot of those humbling moments, but that also means that those are great learning moments that I am actively learning all the time from the people around me. And I'm so grateful for that. I think one of the challenges I've felt is, BPI is in a very exciting and transitional phase where we're adding on a lot of new staff, doing a lot of work in terms of strategic planning and really building out BPI's infrastructure, which is very exciting. But it's also meant that there are points at which I feel a little like I'm spinning my wheels, putting a lot of time and effort, doing research on something that doesn't end up panning out. But in the bigger picture, I see that as all contributing to our work as an organization to make ourselves better. So I think that's a really exciting period, and I've really enjoyed, beyond the substantive work, being able to work on BPI's efforts to really grow and change and reflect on itself and on its past, and think about where it wants to go in the future.
Nancy, I know that you haven't been here that long, but briefly.
Yeah, so I definitely would say one of my joys is the fact that I was able to start my fellowship with 2 other current fellows and 1 former fellow. I think being able to have that kind of support, direct support from people that were, a part of this program and that are a part of this program is really important. So I feel really incredibly lucky to have that opportunity. And I would say, coming from my background that is not Chicago based and that is not Illinois, I definitely have a learning curve, like Amy said, having to Google not just people, but also, certain vocabulary or statutes about a specific policy. All of that is a learning curve. So I think I definitely came into the fellowship knowing that I was going to have to learn a lot and learn things quickly. But, with the support of everyone here, with the support of my supervisor, I do feel like I'm able to take time to actually learn and process everything. So I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Ooh, I'm not doing my job. I didn't unmute. Go ahead, Ashton.
I will jump in. I have highlighted a lot of the things that have been really great joys for me. So I will just quickly say, related to what Amy was saying and sort of the transitional time that BPI is in, I have found it a great joy that I've been involved in a lot of things that I never thought I would have the chance to get involved in, from hiring of one of my supervisors to developing a request for conversation with consultants to do equity, inclusion, and shared power work with BPI, to just all sorts of things that I've learned about nonprofits and fundraising and how they operate, and I will take those with me to the next nonprofit and hopefully play a role in improving that place too. Some of the learning moments that I've had is, of course, the pandemic has forced everyone into a learning moment. I came to BPI to learn how to do policy work, and nothing in the policy world has been any sort of normal in the last 2 years that I've been here. And so it's been really great to learn alongside people who are also teaching me a lot of the things in my day-to-day job. I think that some of the challenges, specifically for me, and I believe also for other fellows that have had to juggle multiple program areas, I think that sort of learning curve to get up to speed can be more difficult. You're trying to learn 2 program areas, you're trying to coordinate with 2 different teams and 2 different supervisors. And while BPI, all of the program areas sort of work together to forward the same goals, the actual work that the teams do is somewhat insular. And so I felt like I was having to juggle not only the sort of onboarding into both of those program areas, but then really being actively involved in them at the same time. I am lucky, again, that it is a small office and I've had lots of support in sort of navigating that situation, occasionally managing up when necessary. And so in the long run, I will take it as a learning moment. And in the immediate moment, sometimes it feels like a challenge.
Thank you for that. And I think I'm just gonna ask maybe 1.5 more questions. Because half a question is always cool. So for emerging policy students or recent law students who are graduating, and they're making this decision about why a fellowship versus something else, right? Whether that's a clerkship or anything, like any of the multiple opportunities. Why do that? Why a fellowship versus another opportunity? If you could speak to that, that would be super helpful. What has been beneficial, or what are some downsides? And I will kick it to Nancy first.
This question is a little bit difficult for me to answer. I think as a policy student, there aren't a lot of dedicated policy fellowships when compared to maybe law students. A lot of my peers went looking for full-time jobs right after graduation. I will say one of the advantages that I felt about this fellowship was how early the application was. The fact that by December, I already knew what I was going to be doing after graduation, and I still had 6 months, 2 quarters left. I think that was, great for me, but it's definitely not the norm for a lot of policy students. I know a lot of my peers were looking in May or June for full-time jobs afterwards. So if you like the fact that the application is early and the fact that you already have clear understanding of where you will be for graduation, it definitely made the summer a lot more enjoyable for me. So I would recommend for any policy student who wants, early deadlines to apply.
Thank you. Ashton?
Well, I mentioned earlier that the fellowship was really important to me because it allowed me to get to know sort of what the other opportunities might be after my fellowship. I was relatively unfamiliar with the advocacy work in Chicago, and these 2 years have allowed me to become really acquainted with it and build relationships with people that I really hope to continue working with no matter where I go next. I would just say the other thing is that I mentioned that I have done law in a variety of capacities, whether that's direct representation, impact litigation, policy work. And I was not sure leaving law school which tool or which capacity I felt strongest in and that I wanted to spend my time using to advocate for the issues that I had already identified. And so again, coming to BPI, where you can sort of use all different tools, exercise different capacities, it gave me a really great opportunity to learn where my strengths are and be able to identify those for my potential next boss.
And I'll just add that, I did do a clerkship for a year prior to coming to BPI for the fellowship. And I think one of the real advantage of the fellowship, particularly the way that BPI does the fellowship, is the exploratory nature of it. So I think the ability to really explore what is the type of work I want to do, what is the type of advocacy I want to do. Also, who do I want to do it with? Who do I want to work with? What type of organization? I think, as Ashton mentioned, you have so many opportunities to connect directly with different organizations here in broader coalitions with city officials, state legislature. There's so many opportunities to make those connections that will help you build your career and also inform what you want to do. So that was really attractive to me and something that I think BPI has definitely helped me with during my time here so far.
Thank you for that. So what I'm hearing is there's opportunities to network. So as you're exploring the substance of what you'd like to do, there's opportunities to network. There's also there's this idea that I'll know what I'm doing once I graduate. And there's just a variety of work that's there. So a fellowship, we want to be able to learn, but it's also this time for us to figure out what do we actually want to do. So last piece, the last half a question, very quick, rapid round. Are there any tips for people who are considering applying? Any tips on your application? I will chime in after you all because I reviewed applications and I helped hire all of the people that you see. I guess technically not myself, but we'll go from there. All right, so I will kick it to Ashton.
My tip is not necessarily going to get you the job, but I think is really important for people that are choosing a fellowship. And that is that the application process is not just for BPI to vet you, but for you to vet BPI. I hope that we've answered a lot of the questions that you might have about BPI and how it operates. But I can tell you from my experience that because I applied at the very last minute, and because I had not been in the area, I did not know much about BPI going into the interview. I knew that it was in Chicago and it said public interest and had some program areas that lined up with things that I wanted to work on. But I made sure to set aside time during my interviews to connect with people like Marshita and others in the office and ask some candid questions about not only how BPI operates, but how BPI is perceived by community members, other nonprofits, government stakeholders. For many reasons, many of which I've named, I'm so glad that I chose to work at BPI, but it is a small office. It is, we're entering a new sort of hybrid reality. And so different people really thrive in different work environments. And so I would just encourage you that as you come into the interview, you're not only prepping your answers to interview questions, but really thinking about what you'd like to know about BPI so that you can make an educated decision. As Nancy mentioned, it is a really early application process. And so for myself, I was pursuing a EJW fellowship and other opportunities that had a much later decision deadline. And I had to make a decision, I believe towards the end of November, about whether to accept the position at BPI or not. And by doing so, I had to forego other opportunities. I'm really glad that I did, but I think it's something to seriously consider as you're sort of trying to figure out what's best for you.
Thanks, Ashton. And doing a time check, I just want to give some quick tips from the other perspective although I agree with everything that Ashton has said, it's not just you are interviewing at an organization, you are interviewing that organization to see if it is the best fit for you. You want to go to a place where you can thrive. Again, hopefully it's BPI, but if it's not, this work is so important wherever you go, you'll be able to be a value add. But as someone who's reviewed applications, what really stands out is when someone is able to be consistent on their story, their theme, and their approach to the work, and making sure that your cover letter makes sense with your resume. Even if you feel like your experience has been disparate and I was a dance coach, and then I was a teacher, and then I was a lawyer, like all of these different pieces, use your cover letter to really tell us how it connects and how you approach the work. Anybody can say, I'm passionate, I'm this, I'm that, but what we're going to be invested in is you. Can I trust that when we have a hard deadline and we have to be stuck in this office together and have very long meetings, are you still going to be able to show up and show out? Can I trust when you interact with people who look like you and some who don't, or even if they do look like you, but they have a completely different life experience than you, that you will treat them with the right amount of care and respect that they deserve? Being able to communicate your humanity. I know that we don't like to talk about that because it's just like, oh, let's be objective. But being able to communicate who you are as a person is very fundamental. And I think that that is a tip that can be used in every application. If a place isn't willing to accept you for who you are, then that is not the place for you. So with that, I want to thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to bpifellowships.org or something like that. Kim, can you drop whatever our email is in the chat? But feel free to reach out to us. Again, the PG deadline, our Polikoff-Gautreaux Fellowship deadline is this Friday. And we really, really look forward to, thank you. See, that's the email. We really look forward to hearing from you all. And if you have any questions, reach out to us. Have a wonderful day.